So we just want to welcome Rick Hardy, who has come to speak to us today in our reconciliation series. And he has a new book, which I will not attempt to pronounce the name of, to avoid embarrassment for all, me especially. And really, many of you will know Rick. He's been a member of our Law Society for many, many years. And way back when my sister worked for the firm he was at as a paralegal when she was very young. She's not very young anymore. And I won't say anything about how old Rick is. So we'll just let Rick begin and carry on. Oh, if you want to ask questions, maybe just raise your hand or something. There will be, I believe, a question and answer once Rick is finished. And we'll try to keep it as informal as possible, but we don't want people tripping over each other.
Okay, well, thank you, Bob. And yeah, you're right. None of us are getting any younger. That's for sure. Paul and I were just reminiscing here, and what I shared with him, I could share with everybody. I turned 75 years old last month, so it's time has gone by. So I'm a little surprised and overwhelmed by what we're doing here today. I thought, half a dozen people sitting around the table just reminiscing or something, but fortunately, last night I got a little worried, so I put some notes together for myself, so I've got something to follow. But it's kind of rambly, and I hope nobody's expecting some sort of learned paper or something, because that's not in the works. Let me start by, first of all, thanking all of you for taking the time from your busy schedules to be here today. I know we're in that day between a weekend and a holiday tomorrow. A lot of people are probably out enjoying this wonderful weather that we're having here. And so thank you for taking a break from that to come and listen to me. And I'd like to thank my friend Paul Andrew for facilitating my being here. And Paul contacted me and asked if I would come and speak to you. And Paul and I are both from the same hometown, with a few years difference, but we basically grew up together. And, so we have a lot in common. As Bob said, I am a retired member. I was called to the bar in 1982, and I retired from the society in 2016 so I spent 34 years as a member. And since then, I've been sitting on a number of different advisory boards, and I've spent the last 2 years completing my memoir. Bob, it's pronounced Mola Ja.
Mola Ja.
Yeah, and it means Mola. That means white man. That's my dad, and Ja means child. That's me there. So that's the name where it comes from. And there's a story in the book that tells you how I came about using that name. I won't get into that right now, because I don't think the lawyers want to hear about my personal life. They're probably more concerned with what I've got to say about residential school and reconciliation. So I know we have a limited amount of time, and I'll try to stick to that. And again, as Bob said, we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end of this. I'm aware of the society's steps with regard to reconciliation as called for by the TRC. I hope today to share with you my experiences related to, quote, the history and legacy of residential schools, which is one of the subtopics in your Working Towards Reconciliation page set out on your website. And you'll pardon me, sometimes I will put these reading glasses on. I just had my eyes fixed about 2 months ago, and I'm waiting for my proper prescription reading glasses, so I'm a little disoriented sometimes. So the topic of reconciliation is a topic I deal with extensively in my memoir. The topic runs as a thread throughout the book, with my personal experiences starting in chapter 14, First Steps to Hell, on page 145 of the book. What I attended were not strictly speaking, residential schools. Just referring to page 149 in the book. If you have the book, you can just follow me. It's available at the bookstore here.
It's true.
And,
Reading it will qualify for CPD.
yes.
There's a plug.
So this distinction between residential schools and school residences is important to my own history and my experience. So what I wrote in the book is another important distinction of the residences from the residential schools is that they were not race-based institutions. The residences were for all students living in the communities that they were from. Consequently, the residences were populated by Indian, Inuit, Metis, and non-Indigenous students. Unlike the earlier residential schools, the parents of Metis and non-Indigenous students no longer had to pay for their children to be educated there. The overall objective was to create public institutions that were paid for by the Government of Canada, which at the time was responsible for the education of all students in the NWT. Prior to that change, which took place in 1959, students did go to residential schools, and the residents and the school were all one institution in one building. What we went to in Inuvik were these residences, which were separate from the school, which was a public school, where all the students that lived in Inuvik, all the students that lived in the Catholic residence, Royer Hall, all the students that lived in Stringer Hall, which was the Anglican residence, we all went to this common public school together. And so I know it's a fine point for some people, but I think it's important that we understand that these were not residential schools. What we went to were student residences, is where we lived. And it was in these, one of the residences, which was run by the Roman Catholic Church, that I and a number of other boys were sexually, physically, mentally, and emotionally abused. These details of these abuses are set out in the memoir. And this happened in the student residence, not the residential school. And what happened to us, and I use the word fortunately here in my notes, but what I say is fortunately for us, the perpetrator, a fellow by the name of Martin Houston, was caught and sent to jail. I and 4 other boys were all called as witnesses in the legal proceedings. We were all 15 years old at the time. The Crown prosecutor was the late David Searle. See him up there on the wall. He was the first president of the Law Society of the NWT. And at that point, I just want to read something else from the book in connection with this is an interesting kind of side story. I guess you can relate it to the history of the Law Society, because some of you may remember that David Searle and I were partners in the law firm of Davis and Company. And I think it was probably going on to maybe 14, 15 years. But after about 10 years of David and I being partners, we came to this realization one day, and I'd like to read this to you. We were twice a year, Davis and Company would have this huge partners gathering. In the spring of every year, we'd find a relatively priced resort off-season rates that we would go and have our partnerships meeting. So David and I were sitting on the front porch of his cabin. David was not only a very good lawyer, he was also quite a raconteur and loved to tell stories about his many experiences practicing law. These stories included ones about his early career when he worked under contract as a Crown prosecutor in the Northwest Territories. he told me a few stories and then started another one with, I can't remember the bastard's name, but I clearly remember prosecuting this supervisor from a hostel in Inuvik. I almost fell off my chair. His name was Martin Houston, I said, and I was one of the witnesses. And David almost fell off his chair. Of course, David did not remember me from that time, as I was only 15 years old. I was one of 5 boys of the same age group that David had examined during Houston's preliminary hearing in Inuvik. On the other hand, I did not remember David from the preliminary hearing because of the memory bank wipe. That's what I refer to as our lost memories from that time. David told me details of the hearing and his impression of some of the witnesses. He said it was unfortunate that the 5 students, including me, were so young. Consequently, we were not able to completely tell our stories. I was not able to tell the whole story of what Houston did to me because he was sitting right there in the courtroom glaring at me. I was at once embarrassed to say the things that he did to me in front of all the strangers in the courtroom. And I was also extremely afraid of Houston. I will never forget him sitting there in the prisoner's box. I call this chapter Serendipity. Who would have ever thought that David Searle and I would have connected at that point in our lives, something that happened so long ago that, and neither one of us remembered the other being there. But it led to even better things because David's memory was very good and he was able to tell me a lot of details that I did not remember and a lot of details of things that I was not aware of. So this was tremendous help because at the time we were involved in negotiating compensation agreements with the government of Canada. And based on the information that David provided to me, we were able to ask for more documents that were needed to help us through the process. So I thought that would be an interesting story, especially in light of David being the first president of the Law Society. So I point out, I attached a number of documents that we were able to obtain as a result of this chance encounter with David. And one of those documents is the entire transcript of David's examination in the court, as well as other court-related documents. And I willingly made the decision to publish them so the world knows what happened to us, because I fear that this happened so long ago. This was back in 1962, 63, and memories are starting to wear away. And so it's all here in black and white. And I have to mention one of my friends that I grew up with, his name is Mike Gladue. He agreed that he would not ask for his name to be redacted. And so he is also part of this, showing it to the world. And I guess the other thing that I would say, I'm rambling off right now, so just bear with me. But the first document that I have presented here in Appendix A is my first statement to the RCMP. And that statement was taken by Hugh Fagan, who was a sergeant in the RCMP in Inuvik in those days. And Hugh Fagan is 92 or 93 years old, and he's still alive. He contacted me a year and a half ago and said, I hear you're writing a book about what happened. And I've got a few things to tell you. So Mike and I got on a plane and we flew down to Ontario, where Hugh is retired now. And we spent 3 days with him, and that visit is in the epilogue to the book. Again, we got more information that we were not aware of. He was more than happy to share with us. One of the interesting things that he told us is that when he would, first of all, when the complaint was referred to the RCMP and I knew that he was in charge, and he said he had to make a decision. He could have assigned it to a lower ranking officer, but he said he just felt so offended by it that he decided to take it on himself. And he traveled to the communities to interview us. One of the things that he told us is that when he came to Fort Norman to interview Mike and I, he said he was really worried that we wouldn't talk. He thought we wouldn't cooperate. And he said he was so surprised. It was almost as if we were waiting for somebody to tell our story to. He said it was an easy interview for him to do because we wanted to tell the story. And so I'm very thankful to Hugh for taking the time to come out and come forward at this point in time and share information that basically only he knew of. Again, it was his impressions of what happened at the time. And our abuser, his name was Martin Houston. He was a lay supervisor in Inuvik. And as a result of the work that Fagan did, the prosecution by Cyril, and the testimony that we gave as witnesses, and the 2 mental health specialists that the prosecution hired to examine him after the preliminary hearing, he eventually decided to plead guilty. And was in those days, I think the law was a little different than what it is today. But we understood he had got a life sentence, but as a dangerous sex offender. We declared a dangerous sex offender. But he ended up only spending 9 years in jail. And he did his applications for parole every 3 years, as he was entitled to. And at the end of the 3rd year period, at year 9, he was released. And one of the things that we found out while we were visiting Hugh, and it was Mike Gladue and I were there visiting Hugh, and Mike said, yeah, I remember Father Adam in Inuvik came to Mike, who would have been about 18 years old at the time, and asked Mike to write a letter saying what a good man Houston was, because the church was trying to get him released from jail, if you can believe it. And so eventually they got him released from jail, and he became Father Martin Houston. He became a priest after all of this. And he died and is buried in the graveyard of the St. Boniface Cathedral. And the inscription on his headstone is, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Come and share in your master's happiness." You can believe what all this bastard did to us. This is how the church treated him at the end. I'm sorry, it's an emotional thing for me, but I really want to share that with you so you get a good understanding of what happened. Not only to me, there was quite a few of us that suffered at the hands of this guy. And never once did the church come to comfort us or say none of this was your fault or anything. They spent their time trying to help this guy, not us. So I get into a lot more detail in the book. Buy the book. So yeah, so that's my story about residential schools. I call them student residences. But I also want to, before I finish and open for questions and answers, I just wanted to say a few words about reconciliation. And, so before I close my presentation and open the floor for questions and discussion, I would like to say a few words about reconciliation. The word is loaded and means different things to different people. I went to law school before the age of internet. And whenever we had a problem like this, we would crack open Webster's for some guidance. Webster's is now available on the internet, so I went there this time. The actual definition of reconciliation is not of much help, as it simply says the action of reconciling. So I went deeper and found that reconcile, of course, has a number of alternative meanings. The first one, and I think the most appropriate for our circumstances here, says to restore to friendship or harmony. For me, the key word is restore. Talk about reconciliation, we're talking about trying to put things back together the way they were. So how can that be done? First, I think that we need to be clear that this restoration has to be between collectives. It's not an individual problem. It's the collective group that the reconciliation has to be done with. On the one hand, there is the collective called Canada. On the other hand, there are various collectives. At a minimum, there are 3 groups of individuals: the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis. I am Métis, so I look at what it is that has to be restored between the Métis and Canada. Reconciliation with the Métis will look different from reconciliation with the First Nations and the Inuit. Therefore, I would suggest distinct tables for each of the Aboriginal groups that are named in the Charter. And in connection with that, I want to read another little bit from the book on page 272. The end of the book, summing up basically. I used to be a lawyer, we sum up. And I had asked a number of questions of myself at the beginning and answering them at the end. But I come to where I've answered those questions, and then I have a section on residential schools. I did not set out to write a book about residential schools. However, my life and the lives of Mama and her siblings, and the lives of my granddad and his siblings, and the lives of Granny and her siblings inevitably led me to having to deal with that elephant in our living room. My mother and my grandparents all were residential schools as well. The easy way out would be to join the rage and choruses condemning the governments and the churches for the system of residential schools that they established in Canada. There is no doubt that these rages and choruses are based on truths, and the heat being placed on the governments and the churches is more than well deserved. However, in the case of my family, we need to face the truth of our particular situation. And again, please bear with me that I am talking about my family, not the entire collective of all the people in Canada. We were not forcefully ripped from our families. We did not have our culture and our languages suppressed. Our parents made the hard decision to send us to school so we could be formally educated and make our way in the white man's world. Those were conscious decisions that clearly set us apart from the Shutargut and other First Nations people. And so the Métis really don't have, at least my family, and I think most Métis families really don't have much to complain about in terms of loss of language or culture. That is definitely an issue for First Nation peoples and for Inuit people. But by the time we were starting to grow up, we had moved more towards the European way of life. And our parents sent us to school to be educated, and they sent us to be in a safe place. not a place where what happened to us did happen. So I want to make that distinction clear, because when we're talking about reconciliation, it's not just a paintbrush all across the Indigenous groups. And so I want to share that with you so that helps you understand a little bit better when you hear Métis being mentioned. And we are a little different than what the First Nations group. There's no question what happened to the First Nations people happened. They absolutely have every right in the world to claim for reconciliation, but it's a different case for the Métis. Wanted to get that on the record, so to speak, and I hope you don't mind me saying that, Paul. And so, yeah, so that's what I've got to say to you today. It's kind of rambly, but so questions and answers, I guess.
Yeah, people, if you'd like to ask questions, just try to not step on each other, and I will step in and wrangle the lawyers if that is necessary. But please go ahead and ask any questions. Unmute yourselves and ask any questions that you may have.
And I'm no longer bound by the rules of the Law Society. I don't have to be polite.
That is very true.
So, don't worry.
I had a question, Rick, about, do you think sexual abuse are handled differently nowadays than the days you were talking about?
I don't know. It's a hard question, because the sexual abuse I'm talking about happened in the context of residential schools and student residences, and they don't have those anymore. So sexual abuse is more than anything else happening in the homes now. And if it's being handled different, I think that society, through the governments, through the legal system, are more open to giving credibility to the complainants now than when it was in our day. But I'm not sure that if it wasn't Hugh Fagan that did the investigation, as to how far we would have got with it. Hugh was quite a unique person. He was really offended by what happened. So we were able to get further into the system than we would have otherwise.
Don't be shy, folks. Ask a question.
Hi, Rick. This is Peter Adorian. I'm a criminal defense lawyer with Legal Aid. I was wondering if, in writing your book, if you came across any good historical resources that would identify what happened at each individual residence or residential school in the NWT, so that I could sort of use that as a resource when I'm talking to clients who've had parents attending a particular school and they don't necessarily know what happened, you know, a place where I can go and get that information.
I'm sorry, but no, I'm not aware of anything like that. But there is a blog called Sylvia's Page. I think it's Sylvia's Page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
Where this blog has reams and reams of information of all of the priests and employees at all these residential schools who have been charged. And so that would probably be the place I would go to. It's called Sylvia's blog, or Sylvia's Page. It's a blog called Sylvia's Page. But as far as any sort of official document, I'm not aware of it. And you know, I can tell you that, you know, in our case, we had a devil of a time getting the court records for what happened to us. So I don't think anybody's gathered all of this stuff in any one place.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? Seeing none, we will wrap this up. Thank you very much for coming. Rick, and we are very appreciative of your time. I see Merrill, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to thank you, Rick. Those aren't easy things to share. And I think the process of reconciliation comes from people like you having the willingness to share it and to teach the truth to the rest of us, and to be still pursuing nonetheless the restoring of the harmony. And I just think that's very important. And I wanted to thank you for what you have done.
Thank you, Merrill. If I may, there's one other thing I would like to talk about. It's not in the book.
Please go ahead.
But last night, as I was preparing these notes, I was thinking of this issue of reconciliation. And what I talked to you about was the reconciliation with the collectives, but there's also reconciliation with the individuals. I know reconciliation is not the really correct term, but that's what we've come to use. But I must say, and this is in a complimentary way, the legal system in Canada, in particular the lawyers, have been way out in front on this. I don't know if you realize this or not, but in the early 1970s, my old friend and my law school mentor, Roger Carter, who was the dean of the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan, got all the deans of law schools in Canada together and said, look, there is a real problem here with the legal system. All the lawyers across Canada, overwhelmingly are white men. And this is probably causing a lot of the problems that we were called Native people in those days. We became Aboriginal, now we're Indigenous, but a lot of the problems that the Native people have is because they're not part of the system. And we as lawyers need to do something to try and make this better. And so Roger Carter and the other deans of the law school agreed on that. And they established the Native Law Center, which was affiliated with the University of Saskatchewan College of Law. And they then created the program of legal studies for Native students. What the program was is that they wanted to encourage more Native people to become lawyers and hopefully eventually judges, so the system might reflect better. And the problem up to that point in time, the Native students like myself getting into law school is that we couldn't compete. The big thing in those days was LSATs. Whoever had the highest LSAT scores, well, they got the few spots that were available. And along with that, there was a real emphasis on having an undergraduate degree and with distinction. And those are two things that Native people just were not able to get, but were actually capable of being good lawyers. And so the deans said, okay, let's see if we can find a way to create some spots for these Native students. And so they got the law schools to agree to open some spots that would be reserved. And what they did then with the summer program for studies for Native students was that if we wanted to become a lawyer and couldn't make it through the normal route, is that we would have to go and get a conditional acceptance from a College of Law saying that if we successfully went through the summer program, they would allow us to go to law school. And so I asked the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan for the conditional acceptance. They gave that to me. And I went into the summer program, which was a 6-week program taught by professors from universities and colleges of law from all across Canada. And during that six-week period, we were assessed by these College of Law professors. And a determination was made whether or not we might succeed in law school if we were admitted. And I think I was in the third summer, the group that went through, there was a little over 20 of us. 5 of us were assessed as, yeah, you've got a chance, you might be able to succeed in law school. So that's how I got into law school. And so it's kudos to the lawyers, the law societies in Canada for taking that initiative. And now we have, quite a few, well, we're now Indigenous people, Indigenous lawyers, we were Native lawyers in those days, but yeah, and so that is one form of reconciliation. And on a personal basis, that has been fantastic for me. Without that initiative by the deans of the law school, I would never have become a lawyer. So thank you. Thank you, all you lawyers, for doing that. So.
Anything else from anyone? I don't see anybody's smiling face, so we will end this. And James Fulford had just sent a note saying, thanks, Rick. I intend to check out your book.
Yes, one last commercial. It's available at the bookseller.
Say it again.
Available at the bookseller.
And the title is
Molaja.
Molaja. I've got it.
And I will be there tomorrow afternoon from 1 to 3 o'clock doing readings and signing books that are bought in the store. So see you there.
Sheila says, thank you so much, Sheila McPherson. Thank you so much, Rick. Too modest to mention you were one of the most successful lawyers in the Northwest Territories, but we all knew that. We all knew that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Rick for sparing some time for us. I think it was one of our best CPDs, and we shall see you on.